So we're going into the direct question phase, and then Ambassador Asar, the way this is going to go down is they have 1 minute max to ask the question, and 5 minutes to respond.
And 5 minutes to respond.
I'm going to put in this both brothers on the line. And make sure that your question is clear, because you can't interrupt the response. So just make sure that you frame it the way that you want to in that 1 minute. First up to bat, if you're ready, is Brother Kamal.
Yep. All right. Question number 1. When did we stop being Africans? And this is all like one question. When did we stop being African? What was the date or time period? Was it during the village raiding on the good ship Jesus, when we landed on these shores? Or better yet, sir, when did we become Americans? What was that date? Was there a conference of stolen Africans that I missed in the history books where unmasked we decided we're now Americans? Or did Caucasoids just wave a magic identity wand and poof, we were miraculously transformed?
Good question. And here's your answer. You became American when your primary language, as I just said, became English. When you no longer categorize and organize the universe in your African traditional way. And although we can speak of Ebonics as a structural way in which we communicate, you can't say that you speak in the same manner as African people do. You no longer have your noun classes that you did in your Niger-Congo languages. You don't have the reduplication aspect, because that doesn't belong in English. And if we had time, we can go through all of the details of the nature of language, of the English language, and the difference, and why every single body that you can name, especially like the book that I just mentioned, the Book of Dawn and Invocations by Ogonu Agu, and people like Malidoma Some, one of the things that they talked about when trying to translate, and we can name any from Soyinke on down the list, every single person that I've read has a hard time trying to translate African concepts into English because they don't exist in English, which means that they don't have the reference points in which Africans have when talking about these concepts. These words don't even exist. That's why we have to, like when we talk about Ma'at, was that 1 minute?
No, you're good.
Okay.
You got 3 minutes.
Okay. Excuse me. I forgot where I was. For instance, like when we talk about Ma'at, how we have to come up with 7 or 8 words to describe this one concept. And as Dr. Raketi Amin in one of her speeches, and you can find it on YouTube because she only has 2 on YouTube, talks about how it's so much more. When you start dealing with African languages and the richness of it, you see the inadequacy of trying to understand them in English, and why African people tell you to learn African languages. It is totally different, the conceptualizations that exist in African languages. If it was just based on vocabulary, we can argue that English and French and Basque and all of these, and then a lot of the Greek terms in which we use are just African words. But why are just not having the words making them African? There's a linguist by the name of G.J.K. Campbell Dunn who has written, that's all he writes about is the African origins of these Indo-European languages. But how they've changed over time because they didn't have the cultural nuances in which Africans have. So meanings have changed, pronunciations have changed. And this is the issue that you find here in the Americas. So it is not an issue. Remember that we became acculturated over a process of time. The earlier that we got here, we kept a lot of our African traditions. That's what they talk about in Africanism in American culture. But as we began to integrate more and more into the American society, we lost a lot of these nuances, and we lost the meanings of it. So you can't argue in 2010 that you had the same Africanism, same African mode of way of seeing the world that you did in 1823 when we were still coming over here. And that's why I'd say do the comparison. Compare African-American thought and process and things to the people in Brazil and Cuba and Haiti, who still honor their gods in the same name. Like, Olodumare is Olodumare in Brazil. We don't worship Olodumare here. We worship Jesus. We don't honor Eshu. And I'm talking about just us in totality. Not the ones who consciously sought out their African culture and worship Oshun and things of this nature. In Cuba, they still honor these deities. They still make sacrifices. They still have the signs and symbols. All of this is expressed in Africanisms in American culture. Or you can get Robert Parrish Thomas' book, Flash of the Spirit, which goes into this in the detail. When everybody talks about the strong Africanism, they always go to South America and the islands, because that's where the retention is here. Over here, we had strict laws that prevented them. They stripped the majority of everything to where you lost the nuances. That's why you only have isms now. We can only speak of a syntax. You can't speak of a system like when we talk about voodoo. What is the African spiritual system here? We have juju, which just is an application of herbs, a way of healing, but not a spiritual system where we keep our names intact. So the language piece is very important to the question which you just asked.
Very good. That's like right on time. 3 seconds left.
All right.
Okay. Can y'all guys hear me?
Yep.
Hello. You can hear me?
Yeah, hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Asar's question is next, and then Kamal has 5 minutes to respond.
And Kamal, I'm just gonna like I'm doing. So I'm just gonna let the 5 minutes go. When you hear it, there's no need to panic. Just know that means just to tie it up. When you hear that alarm, it means you need to just tie it in. I don't want to interrupt.
Okay.
That.
Okay. So now, based on that same trajectory of thought, my question is, when did Africans become African? When we left the shores, did the Yoruba know they were Africans? Did the Luba know that they were Africans? Did the Wolof Huasis know that they were Africans? Who named us Africans? And if the African people didn't have any say-so on this, how can one argue that one is African if you don't even know what the term means, where it came from, how it is used in the culture, and especially when there is no African nationwide political system, especially since even the president of Senegal in 2010 was talking about creating an African state like we have in the United States. So the question again is twofold. When did we become African by the term? Who named us African? And how could we be African if the Africans have not come together to become Africans?
I'll start the time.
I know that's part of the entire reason why you wrote your book, and you questioned Gerald Massey and his Afri-Week thesis. You questioned Kwesi Rodnahim Batai Khan and his Afrikanitnut. And that's nice. That's interesting. The larger answer is we became African when the creative forces raised that first landmass up, and the first human beings were created. If you don't like the term African, then we can get into, again, the biogenetics of the people, what they look like, and how that has maintained itself throughout the beginning of time until today. You can go talk to the San people. They still look like how they did 200,000 years ago. You can deal with the cultural practices of the untainted traditional people on the place that we now call Africa. And you'll see the circle dance. You'll see ancestral veneration. You'll see the different priesthoods and priestesses hoods. So we can quibble about the name of the continent. Of course, we can all say, well, the folks over there didn't have a name for the entire landmass. We could go there. But if you want to get deeper and look at the people and then what the people produced, and then I ain't even talked about how the people actually live. Since you want to quote Joe, let's quote Joe in Cultural Unity of Black Africa, the Southern Cradle, Northern Cradle hypothesis that he puts on. The Southern Cradle, respect for the environment, harmony environment, female-male parity, those are some of the quote-unquote African qualities that when you look at the different groups on the continent, the traditional untainted groups, you find that East, West, North, South, and Central, they still exhibit, even though some of them are 2,000-3,000 miles away. So I'm going to stay away from the specific etymological breakdown of what our home was called, and I'll even agree that maybe the nationalists over here and the nationalists on the continent need to sit down and figure out what, if we want to, and what we want to call the landmass that created us. But when you look at the people, when you look at the cultural practices, when you look at the axiological breakdown, you see similarity, east, west, north, and south, and for some reason you keep missing those similarities even here in America. Again, another book, the people you don't mention are very interesting. Amerikkkan and Let the Circle Be Unbroken, Implications for Spirituality in the Diaspora. 53 pages would shut down your whole argument. I could just read this book, and she breaks down how it goes deeper than just these surface things that you keep bringing up. But that's getting to something else. I'll leave it there.
Okay. So, Brother Kamal, you got two more questions left. So your next question will be 1 minute, and Sarah will respond.
Question number 2. What self-identified African-centered scholar has stated verbally or in print that we are Americans with tattered vestiges of Africa loosely clinging to our being? Dr. Clark never said we were Americans with Africanisms. Amos Wilson never said that. Dr. Joke, Dr. Ben, Mama Marimba, Dr. Nobles never said we were Americans with Africanisms. From my reading from all of them, only you, Asar Imhotep, stand alone in this statement. So can you please share with me which scholars would share your debate point today?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a difference between somebody who reads material and an independent researcher. An independent researcher asks new research questions and can stand alone regardless if everybody else has a particular worldview. That's what we call in science, in the range of debate, when somebody is basing their argument on authority instead of the content, instead of the merits of the argument. And whether they specifically say the words that you said is irrelevant, because I would offer them the same question, and they will be stumped just like you were with the question. Because if there is no African political state, and this is where the contradiction would come in for Dr. Amos Wilson, if he's arguing that culture is a political organization, and there was no African political organization when Africans were stolen, you can't argue for an African culture. You can argue for an Igbo culture. You can argue for a Yoruba culture. You can argue for the states of Angola, Kinshasa, these places. You can't argue for an African culture. And this is the basis of my argument, that the reason, even to this date in 2010, they're still arguing, trying to, if you look on YouTube right now, and you type in Malefe Kiti Asante, he's sitting up there arguing in 2009, I believe, or was it 2007, at a Sankofa conference, about how they're trying to organize now an African political state. You can only organize an African political state if one does not exist, and that's the point. You're trying to separate culture, identity, from the politicalness, the political organization which defines it. And that's what you can't do. And so everybody's sitting here trying to argue this point. Every single time I ask somebody this point, they stumble. They can't think of it because you can't argue that an Africa existed. And then when I deal with the whole term Africa, even if you say that you are African, you are reactionary when you say that you're African, because white people named you when they said Africa, And I deal with this in a large part of the book. I've had it read by scholars. They could not answer in the same way. So if we can't be reactionary all the time, it's about proaction. That's the whole point of this. Culture is intentional. People organize. Unless you organize the isms, you have no culture. You're just a population with loose nuances. And this is why, and I guarantee you, for anybody who's ever tried to organize anything among African people will know immediately that you don't have an African culture. That we don't even have an African-American culture or whatnot. Try to raise money for African causes, for black folks. You will not get the amount of mass involvement that Jews would, because they have a unifying culture. Asians can come together, Irish, because they have a unifying culture and they recognize it as such. We're still arguing with whether Americans are African, because we don't have a culture. And it's because we do not have an organized political system, and neither did Africa at the time. Africa is forced, because of colonialism and slavery, to put together an African state. And this is what they're working on now. If you don't have an African state, you don't have a centralized African language, you don't have a centralized worldview, we just have substratum, as Chekhov argues in all of his work, then you don't have a culture. You don't have an argument. And that's just how it is.
Okay. So, Asar, you can ask the next question, and Kamal can rebut.
Okay. The next question, I asked this actually earlier, but I'm going to re-ask it now. When we talk about these African worldviews and customs and things of this nature, what separates Africans culturally, mentally, from Native Americans and Southeast Asians? What are the cultural nuances? And then from that, are their nuances, or if they match, if you agree that they match, are they just really practicing, is it everything that they do, is it African, or is it Native American or Southeast Asian, using these blanket terms for all of these different people? So what's the difference between Native Americans in their traditional ways and Africans in their traditional ways? Same thing with Southeast Asian.
Don't start the clock yet. Hold on. So when you say Southeast Asian, which more group? Which groups are you more referring to? So I can be clear.
I'm talking about your Cambodians, your Vietnamese, we can go all the way up north into China, your First Dravidians. This was prior to the Aryan invasion into the area. And going up into China, if you want to go to Japan. What is the difference? What separates African cultures, since we're lumping this together, and those Southeast Asian, if we want to go here to the Cherokee, to the, and even that's a made-up name, to the Navajo, if you know the differences between these groups, we can go there as well. So specifically those are non-Aryan invasion, non-Arab cultures of Asia, basically, and non-European like Russia and things of that nature.
Okay. The first thing, with the non-invasion, if we again go on, there's three groups of Africans: those that never left, those that voluntarily left, and those that involuntarily left. It could be a good argument that those who voluntarily left to populate the world yes, brought over a large continuation of African spiritual systems with them. The differentiation would be in the specific environment that they were in. They would relate to the different spirits in the environment differently. In places where you got highland, where you got lowlands, you might not have too many mountain deities. In places that are landlocked, you might not have too many river deities. So the understanding of for the what word am I looking for? The understanding of there we go. The understanding of the different spiritual forces, I would say that came from that voluntary group that left and populated the rest of the world. Understanding that you had to propitiate the different elements of nature and understand and figure things out, and where was this shrine and where is this spirit and what to do. But the differentiations probably necessarily came from the particular environment. They also may have come from different human dynamics within how they generally interacted. But not having a wide knowledge in Native American spiritual system, in the Southeast Asian spiritual system, stuff like that, I can only speak in generalities because I didn't know we was going to have a religious debate here. I would have been prepared for that. But as far as the cultural piece, I'll just restate again, yeah, that voluntary group who left to populate, who were the first to populate the planet, they brought over their specific quote-unquote African, if you want to put that in quotes, understandings of the spiritual realm and the natural environment. They brought that with them to the particular environments where they ended up, and the differentiation happened based on environment, what was there, what wasn't there, what could be done based on what was there and wasn't there, and probably different individual and human-based interactions, different animals. You got to change up the nature of your sacrifice depending on the animals you got there or don't have there, all that sort of stuff. That's the best general answer I can give. And also, I guess real quickly, even on page 239 of Sankofa Movement, again, by another author, I don't know if you're familiar with, Kwame Aj Mamakuya Koto, they have a nice graph doing the range of cultural and spiritual expressions. And the top part of the graph is African primal cultural expressions, which is traditional Africosmology, and then they list a few others within this primal experience: Australian, Mayan, Amazonian, Native American, Papa, traditional, and the Dalit. They have a transitional or threshold expressions, those would be characterized by Tao, Buddhism, Baha'i, Jain, Santeria, the Shango priests. And then the non-African, Indo-European, and Aryan conquest cultural expressions is all the other stuff: Hinduism, atheism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. So, yeah, there's some similarities with those other groups, but I've already stated where there was probably some differentiation.
All righty. So, Kamal, you have your last question, and Asar can respond.
Now, I'm asking this question I'm asking this question because I've noticed, and again, Babaji Mamakuya have noticed, that there seems to be a disconnect between intellects who study Africa and practitioners of the African systems, especially, period, but especially over here in the West. So this question is, Asar, is there a traditional Ifa, Akan, or Vodun, or classical, Asar said, African spiritual system, or quote-unquote house, that you yourself are an active member in?
Is that it?
Yep.
Okay. Well, yes. One, I'm a practitioner of Ifa. Two, also of the Congo system. And still trying to find the relevance in the context of say, of the identity of Africa as a continent. There's certain things that I know, like there's a certain priesthood that exists on the continent with the elders. They speak the same language no matter where you go. I even wrote on an article on my website called it African Superhighway of Wisdom, where Africans travel to learn from one another, to share information and priesthood. That
was one of your better works. Oh.
Does not mean that it was a political system, and we seem to be missing this part of the discussion and, trying to scapegoat. And just like with the last thing, I can tell you there is no difference between Native American tradition and African tradition. What it all boils down to is language. That's why in all of the things that I quoted, it boiled it down to language. And there's no continental-wide African language. You have language families. They're arguing whether Kiswahili should be the language. But you can't have a political system unless everybody can communicate with each other. Now, in priesthoods, they have certain signs and symbols and certain sacred languages in which they can communicate. But if everybody doesn't have access to it, that is not a nationwide thing. So, trying to find the relevance in your question, to the overall discussion, if you're trying to check my authenticity as a practitioner and as a scholar, as what Dr. Kakosa Kajangu calls a post-colonial scholar. These are scholars who initiated into African systems and also into and into the academics who are also academicians. That's the term he uses. If we want to, utilize that today. So, that's a simple answer, a simple question to answer.
That's it? Okay. So the last question is Asar to Kamal, and then we'll go to the conclusions.
Again, I'm gonna keep re-emphasizing this concept of organization. When in American history, because one cannot deny that a lot has been lost through the transatlantic slave holocaust and the subsequent Jim Crow, civil rights era, and things of this nature. So when did we collectively come together to Africanize ourselves, to understand these nuances outside small pockets of individuals? Where is our political system? Who are our leaders? Who did we vote? Who do they respond? Who are they responsible for? Things of this nature. What are their responsibilities to the community and things of this nature? That's my question. What's the name of the political organization in which African Americans adhere to? Who are leaders and things of that nature? Go ahead.
See, the issue with that question, again, is we both agree that a transformation has happened. We diverge that you see it as a total eradication of our Africanness, and I see it as just a transformation of consciousness. So, and one thing, language is key. Language is big. But you overemphasize language because the number one thing that hasn't been really talked about, well, that hasn't been talked about by you, and that I've been trying to bring up in here is spirit, the spirit piece. We are African just alone because we were the Creator made us thusly. We are African because of those different Africanisms that pop up. If we had totally been transformed and changed, those wouldn't even pop up. the question becomes using those Africanisms for the things that you're talking about. And some of the folks who you may not have finished fully reading, or some of the folks who you may not know about, are at the forefront of first getting us to understand we're African, showing us how we're African, and then organizing around that. But if those first two things aren't there, then that can't be done. But your position that we are essentially Americans with a few tattered pieces of Africa with us, we ain't going to get there that way. And the research doesn't back you up. And there's a misread of the Africanism. The Africanisms are the tangible empirical evidence that we're still African. Now it's about getting right-minded people to share that with the wider populace, get them to get rid of this idea that they are Americans, and then move forward from that. And in my closing, I'm going to read a quote from Dr. Ani that talks about the majority of our Africanists right now operates on an unconscious level. And so for your question to come into fruition, she says it needs to be moved to the conscious level to do it. But we ain't going to get there from your position that we're Americans right now, because it's not true. And the book you love to talk about, Africanism, and there are better ones out there, but Africanisms and American culture, when looked at the proper way, shows that we're still African. So it's about using that information to wake up the masses, to wake up black folks to who they really are, de-link them from America, and then use that understanding for the political organization, for the societal betterment, and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, you're not catching me there. I know it doesn't exist, but we get there quicker from my angle. We're not going to get there from yours. We will stay. I'm going into my closing stuff, but we will stay right here in this American mentality if we follow what you're talking about. I'm through.
All right. So we're going to go into the conclusions, and you're up to bat first, Kamal. So anytime you're ready, let us all know.
Oh, me? I thought he was clear. Okay. Oh, all right. You have to accept a concept of reality that makes them superior, them being white folks. If you deny that, their thing will not work, and they will lose their control. We are We are American extensions of our African history. Just like those scattered elsewhere are those regional extensions of their African history. We must remember, quote, when a people and a nation's history are disrupted, their cultural practices illegalized, their physical integrity is forcibly scattered and terrorized, those people do not cease to exist. The history continues to exist as it is beyond the capacity of one human or one human group to destroy the historical and cultural reality of another. And I'll say this again. The African deities tell us what is given by the Creator cannot be taken by man. While my position, we are Africans with Americanism, poses to wake stolen Africans up, his American argument can and will put the masses to sleep. If he is correct, the African masses can say, yeah, I got some African shit in me, but I'm American because this is all I know. Come to think of it, we've been identifying with America since the start of around the 1900s. Us identifying with America has created the conditions talk shows like this were created to combat. American with Africanisms is wrong. It doesn't further the race. It doesn't give us vision. It keeps what we are doing now going. Until the conscious identification with America stops, our decadent and deplorable conditions will continue. We have been lied to that we are not Africans. So what was the purpose of our Americanisms, and how did they start? Do a quick history here. In 1491, you've got the first recorded African to give up their unique way of venerating the universe, and I said recorded, and adopting a foreign way of life. This was the Congo king Nzongo Nkuwu. He was converted and baptized in May of that year and changed his name to Dom Jao I. Nzinga Zimba, his son, was taken by Portuguese ways, and he converted in 1506, and his Christian name became Dom Alfonso. The unwritten Caucasoid context of this experiment was to see if they could, quote-unquote, civilize the king by exposing him to the, quote-unquote, civilized reality of Caucasoid. The experiment was to get us to not identify with Africa or our African ways. It was to get us to identify with someone and something else. This experiment exceeded Caucasoid expectations. These people had their African consciousness transformed through changing of their names. They had their spirituality changed. The consciousness of their spirituality changed because they was given Christianity. They opened up Angola, that part of Angola, to Christianity. They had their consciousness transformed away from their African customs and value systems by popularizing Caucasoid customs and values within their society. And this opened them up to eventual enslavement and the erosion of their ways. Now, since this was the first run, they didn't explicitly try to get them to personally identify as Portuguese. But through centuries of refinement, as we've heard tonight, it is now us who voluntarily identify with whatever foreign land we are on over our innate origins, and the consequences of buying into this so-called common sense, we're in America now, so we're Americans logic, actually continues the Portuguese then, full Caucasoid now, anti-African civilizing legacy. This medieval experiment was informally renamed the house slave syndrome, which was the continued creation of transforming African people's consciousness and quote-unquote rewarding them. This house slave system was informally renamed the middle class, the refined continuation of transforming African people's consciousness, rewarding them for it, and then having them serve as the buffer group to shield Caucasoids. The lesson of all of this, the crackers learned then that's still operating to this nanosecond, is always create and quote-unquote reward stolen Africans who do not identify with Africa or their Africanness. However, within each time period I just mentioned, there has always been Africans who consciously and deliberately kept their Amun-Ra given Africanness prominent in their lives. In 1520, you had the Angola of Ndongo. They tried to come and convert him to Christianity. He said, I don't want nothing to do with your religion or your way of life. I just want your material goods. The house slave syndrome was countered by the more successful maroon communities. And the middle class syndrome is being countered today by self-avowed African-centered living communities. It's always been about countering what has been done, not succumbing to it and passing it off as common sense logic. We can no longer accept the lie that we are not Africans. The idea of us being Americans with Africanism plays into the hands of white folks by letting them beat their chests and gives them the idea they can actually make Africans disappear just by relocating them, changing their language, and transforming their consciousness. The idea of us being American with Africanisms means our 200,000-year cultural incubator can just totally be wiped out by the last 500 years blip in time. It cannot happen. It has not happened. What has been given by the Creator cannot be taken by any man. The idea of us being American with Africanisms helps the Caucasoid agenda by cutting us off from identifying with Africa and Africans, even though, like I already said, if you drop any of us off on the continent, we don't open our mouths, they will immediately just see us as African. We need to build on that and not chop it down. The idea of us being Americans with Africanism buys into Euro-American propaganda. They make it seem like common sense. And again, anything that seems like common sense in this environment, we need to check that shit quick and go the other way. Euro-Americans benefit from this identity lie that we're Americans from the collective $1 trillion that benefit their businesses. Euro-Americans benefit from this identity lie that we're Americans from all the time we spend at their jobs working for them and their bottom lines. Euro-Americans benefit from this grand identity lie that we're Americans from all the resources we put into their damn reality. All that money, time, and resources could be better used on ourselves first, when we properly identify ourselves as Africans, deliberately become reaware of that reality, and use that to build our sovereign nation. They benefit on us focusing on this small little 500-year blip of time and not looking at in the proper context of at least 200,000 years we've been on this planet in Homo sapiens sapien form. So I ask, are we following the Booker T mistake when we should have followed the Garvey model today in 2010? We laid our buckets down then in America. What do we now have for it? American with Afrikanisms? Really? Really? We've never stopped being African. We've been lied to and haven't been given or not taken the time to get back in touch with who we really are. I'm going to keep saying this, we were originally created as Africans by the African creative forces of the universe. Spirit has been totally devoid out of my opponent's argument. Only recently, check this, only recently have we been told we are Americans. Ironically enough, by the same people who stole us in the first place. So the question becomes, who has more weight for you in your life, dear listener? Ra, Yame, our African gods, or white people who create census forms? This American identity thing is only a man-made law on their books. If two Africans have a child in China, that child is not Chinese. That child is an African child born in China. If two Africans have a child in Russia, that child is not Russian. It's an African child born in Russia. And we all know the Baba Omawale quote, if a cat has babies in an oven, did the cat have biscuits? No, the cat had kittens that were born in an oven. And one of my favorite African proverbs, if a log stays in a river for 10 years, it will not become a crocodile. I'll even add that to say if a log stays in a river 500 years, it won't become a crocodile. It's just a very damp, wet piece of wood. Folks don't like identifying with the quote-unquote losing team, the quote-unquote underdog. But only for the last 500 years has Africa been losing that cultural battle. The secret to all successful maroon groups, North Carolina, Jamaica, Brazil, was their reattachment to their innate Africanness and addressing their present realities based on that. It's beyond time to study those examples, learn from those examples, and reduplicate those successful examples. Detaching us from the depth and consciousness of our African way of life was Caucasoid's greatest trick and Caucasoid-minded people. Caucasoid-minded people's greatest trick. Reattachment to that depth and that consciousness, that high culture and deep thought that the real Wade Nobles talks about will be our greatest victory. We were not conquered. We were confused. And we're seeing that confusion. I'm going to say it again. My idea opponent says we're Americans with Afrikanisms. However, most of the people he cites in his books and recommends to other folks never said that. He's an independent researcher. But Dr. Clark never said it. Amos Wilson never said we were Americans with Afrikanism. Jope never said it. Dr. Nobles never said it. However, there is a small list of people who do call us Americans. Cornel West, Jesse Lee Peterson, Armstrong Williams, Edward Richburg, Shelby Steele, Henry Louis Gates. All within the sound of my voice, I ask you, which identity camp do you want to align yourself with? Those whose writings and life's works were explicitly dedicated to the sovereignty of African people, or those who constantly tell us we're Americans, Africa has no large expression in our lives, get over it. If you agree with that last group that we're Americans because that's all we know, unfortunately you have fallen prey to Caucasoid propaganda, but all hope is not lost. The work of those first groups are in abundance. It's time to relearn, reacquaint, and re-embrace our African history. Now, I ain't do the cute slideshow, but for anyone, I did create a bibliography, and I'm reading this as well, so I can get it to anyone. Email me at kamal301@yahoo.com, and I can send it to you. I'm quoting Mama Rimbani, our Africanness has existed within us primarily on an unconscious level, but the forces of evil are strong. European colonialism is powerful, and the unconscious survival of African heritage within us is not enough to subdue it. This survival must be moved to the level of conscious awareness so that it can be used for political analysis, motivation, and commitment. We must turn our spirituality, our ethos, our Africanness into a political tool. We must harness the energies that lie dormant within and forge them into a powerful political force for liberation and self-determination. I will end. We can defeat this grand identity lie, but each one of us first must identify and reclaim our African identity and start being African more and more every day in all the things we do. Drop as many harmful Americanisms as possible, or as Obadele says, de-whitenize and re-Africanize, both simultaneously. Get with other people of like minds who are doing the same thing, and let's create this damn sovereign African nation, starting first on correct identity and cultural grounds.
Okay. I just want to say something, because as Saul gives his concluding, we're going to go into the overtime. I have to bring people in because once we get past the live show, I'm going to lose the board, so it won't be any way to ask questions. So I'm going to make a request. If you're on the line right now, mute your phone, because if you don't mute your phone, it's going to drown out everything that Asar is saying. So mute your phone if you're on the line, if you got your hand up or you don't have your hand up. Mute the line, because once the show is getting ready to end, I'm going to bring you in at the 1 minute mark. So your phone has got to be muted. Please, people, don't let me hear you go into the bathroom. Okay?
Yeah, and then you get a chance to ask these brothers questions.
All right. So you're up, Asar.
Peace. Once again, thank you for the discussion and allowing us to have this dialogue. My position is pretty clear. I don't have an elaborate ending. We are Americans because, one, we live in America. It is our political home. Secondly, we speak American English and have lost the languages that we spoke prior to arriving here. There are several different things that I could address in that last attempt at a response. But I'm gonna read something a little later, but I'm gonna read something now from Dr. Shekan Tejok. In April 4th of 1985, he came to Morehouse College. And when he was there, you could find this work in Great African Thinkers by edited by Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. And in this, on page 320, the year 1986, it says, this is Shekan Tejok speaking, we must reconstruct a new Afro-American cultural personality within the framework of our respective nations. Our history from the beginning of mankind, rediscovered and relived as such, will be the foundation of this new personality. And if anybody has read the work, knows that I don't argue that everything was taken away from us. And if we were to believe Kamal, he would make it seem like this is what he calls a common sense argument, and which I would have to disagree. This is an argument based on years of research and reading many scholars in which we do not have time to address here on this issue of culture, black, white, Asian, Native American, or whatnot. And I quote a little bit of everybody in the Bacala of North America. And again, we have fundamental flaws in his argument. He tries to use the Malcolm X cat born in the oven, argument, and that's essentially the problematic which I addressed at the beginning of the discussion. It's one based on biology, which we can undeniably, by way of genetics and paleoanthropology, say that everybody's an African. If we go by his logic, there is no distinction. He already could not distinguish, based upon his logic, the difference between an African and a Native American. Now, when we come to this issue of time, we have this issue of, for instance, you have like the Arabs who have been in North Africa and Africa for more than 2,000 years. At what point did they become African? We have Europeans who have been in Africa for about 500 years. You know, and more than that, actually, if we go, because they've been in there since Pharaonic time. You know, we have the records, of course, of ancient Egypt, of Europeans being in Egypt since 1500 BCE. You know, we have the issue of the Africans themselves. Now, you know, what I'm trying to bring out is the necessary contradiction in trying to reduce everything to the African continent. Because if we talk about the Australian Aborigines, who are definitely black, can you say that they're African if they've been there for 30,000, 40,000 years and not migrating back into Africa? You know, these are the kinds of questions that people need to really think about. If there is no political system, you know, he tries to skate around the fact that it was not called Africa. Africans didn't call the continent. I'm not even sure if they understood the boundaries of the continent in full in that way to name the whole continent. That is a European concept to go around naming continents and naming whole people. You don't find that in African traditional systems. You won't find any record of that. Only when Europeans come in and name all Africa Ethiopia. You know, the Arabs come over here naming it, you know, Sudan. You know, then, of course, Americans naming it Negro land. You know, of course, the Romans doing it with Africa after a small Berber people named the Afrik. And the Arabs coming in saying Afrika. This is where the term comes from. But no one knows what the meaning is. You know, there was no unified African state, no unified African language, nothing in existence for one to say conclusively that there was an African in the correct cultural terms, in which I cited, you know, exclusively these particular scholars, in which, of course, he has not read all the material. I would assume has not contemplated it. But I'm going to end on Dr. Noble again, because this is how you have to wait. You know, it's not enough to just throw terms out there. You have to weigh them against definitions and concepts. So we're going to continue to quote Dr. Noble. And I already cited the actual particular source of this, but this is slide number 25. I'll be reading slide 25 and 26 on my slideshow. The system, and we're talking about culture here, and he's talking about culture in the context, and this is right on time for the whole Arizona ethnic studies debate, which is a totally different topic. But anyway, because this is dealing with education. The system of culture teaches the people to recognize phenomena and to respect certain logical relations amongst phenomena. Culture gives meaning to reality. As such, culture has the power to compel behavior and the capacity to reinforce ideas and beliefs about human functioning, including issues of educational achievement and motivation. As such, culture is the invisible medium in which all human functioning occurs. It is important to note, in fact, that nothing human happens outside of culture. To think of culture as the medium in the petri dish is an appropriate analogy. It is the stuff in which human development occurs. Going to the next slide. Culture is to humans as water is to fish. It is our total environment as such. Education as well as curriculum development are cultural phenomena. Culture is therefore the invisible dimension of all curricula. Hence, just as the nature of the water, salt versus fresh versus polluted water, influences the reality, the survivability of particular types of fish, so too do different cultural systems influence the reality of particular groups of people. In fact, all of our training and education are bound by what we call customs of professional convention, which are nothing more than cultural traits or rituals. Culture is like our water, and like the fish out of water, some humans can be out of their culture and thereby act inappropriately or fail to thrive. In a similar analogy, culture is like the electricity that illuminates the light bulb. We can only know or understand the electricity by what it does. Accordingly, if we are going to have a practice of education that's appropriate for African American children, then it should be clear that we need to understand the electricity that's going to guide the practice. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here, but I like that water analogy, because if you take something out of its natural environment and put it in another, it affects them to the point where it can either make them thrive or pollute them and kill them. Now, all of these books and stuff in which I mentioned earlier, they would not exist. There would be no reason for breaking down the psychological aspects of mental slavery, a blueprint for black power and all of these other different works, if there was no environment change, no cultural change. We were not taken out of our African waters and brought over here into these American waters, using the analogy of water or the seas or whatnot being culture, and regardless of how he likes to word it, everything that these authors are writing are supporting my point. Now, when we talk to these African authors, they all boil down to language. And notice what I've done here. When I quote the African authors, they all boil it down to language. When we talk about the African American authors, they don't deal with language because most of them aren't linguists, And this is very important because if you can't articulate the world in your own language, you can't argue that you're essentially your culture. And because you have no culture, culture boils down to language. That's the difference between Native American cultures and African cultures. Native Americans have feathers, we have feathers. Of course, they had, the teepees and the circular shapes. We had the huts in the circular shapes. They honor ancestors. They pour libations. They recognize the earth as symbols. They have a priesthood. They respect their elders. They have initiation rites. There's nothing that separates them other than a few, quote-unquote, genetic haplotype markers, which is insignificant in the final analysis of genetics, and their language. So until you're ready to deal with the language piece and not skip around it and skate around it, then you're not prepared to really have this full discussion. And that's what I end on.
That applause was for both of you gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Definitely.
Thank you. This was a good debate. And the applause was also for my callers because nobody flushed their toilet. I didn't hear any farting or burping. I'm proud of you guys, man.
That's right. I'm sure.
All right. Now, this is going to be a little interesting because I don't have control over the board. So you can the person who wants to ask a question can unmute your phone and just direct it to whichever participant you want. Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, okay. I want to support what you just said. Both scholars, both brothers were excellent in their argument. And I just have a kind of a comment that I want them to respond to, because to me it seemed like they were agreeing with each other. And the question really becomes, where do we go from here? And for Brother Asir, it's a quote by Nkrumah that says, start with what they know, build on what they have. And for Brother Kamal, there's a quote by Amilcar Cabral, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. And what I've come to understand is it's not just what we argue, but why we argue something in terms of the ends, in terms of the ultimate goals. So in this dealing with this question, Brother Sarah, I'm wondering, what are your goals, your long-term goals, in terms of trying to get us to see that we're more American than we are African? And then the reverse is appropriate question for Brother Kamal. What are the long-term goals in terms of emphasizing our Africanness, even in light of so much cultural confusion? And I would like y'all to take those two quotes into consideration as you answer those questions. Again, for Brother Asir and Nkrumah, start with what they know, build on what they have. And for Brother Kamal, tell no lies, claim no easy victories.
All right. Great question, great question. I'm not sure if you've read my book, The Makala of North America, but if you have the opportunity, I highly recommend for an expanded, more detailed discussion on many of the points in which we're talking about now and which directly answer your question. In the long term, what I'm trying to create here is, well, in the short term, is going to be what I call the African American Cultural Development Project. And once again, through my years of study of culture, no matter, there has not been any single scholar who has contradicted this, that culture is intentional, that people sit down and organize culture. This has not happened in African American history. We have never sat down to organize our culture. And see, and this is where it seems like we agree, me and Brother Kamal, because I don't disagree that the Africanisms are there. You know, I argue that in the book, so it's kind of mute to argue that point. What I'm arguing is that it has not been organized into a systematized culture, and that's the difference. Culture isn't something that is accidental. It is something that people organize. So, you know, we always hear it, you know, what time is it? Nation time. We have to organize. That's all we talk about is organize, organize, organize. Organize what? You have to organize your thought processes. You have to organize your values. You have to organize how you're going to create the institutions which are transfer the information, which teach people how to be the culture in which you create. These are the things in the long term we have to have, which all these other individuals, when we talk about Jews, when we talk about Asians coming over here, they have this already. And this is why they're able to do what they do, because they have a unifying culture. In America, we're just a population of black people. And what I'm trying to do is to understand, like, there's a whole, like, the parts of the book in which you're talking about I'm misrepresented as far as Dr. Nobles. All it does is address the culturalisms that we share with Africa. That's all I do with the book. I'm sharing, like, what it is that we believe here in America, how it relates to people on the continent. So I'm starting with what people know, you know, so you can see, oh, I see how we relate, how these thought processes and things. The difference is that there's no organization. When I talk about a Yoruba culture, it's organized. When I talk about an Igbo culture, it's organized. When I talk about, you know, a Hausa or a Congo and all of these things, all they talk about is organization. Until it is organized, that you sit down and think and strategize, how are you going to use the culture? How are you going to educate your people? How are you going to create a mode of production? You know, you have to think of it in the nation terms. This is about nationhood. Culture deals with nations. If you don't have a nation, you don't think nationally. You don't have a culture. Nation of Islam has a culture. You have your Greek fraternities and sororities that have a culture. You have these quote-unquote subcultures that have all the elements of culture. But when we're talking about all of African Americans, 40 million of us here in the United States, we do not have a culture, whether it's African, you know, and I'm talking about our own distinctive culture, whether you call it African or not. Everything, our value system, everything is European. And this is why we have all of these books, why we even have this show, Holism, so we can counter these Americanisms that have such the majority of the stronghold of our people. In order to do that, you have to be able to start with what they know, like you said. Deal with the culturisms. That's why I recommend the Africanisms in American culture. It lets you know what these nuances mean. So now you can open up the door for people to be like, okay, I can embrace this African thing better. So I don't know what he's talking about. I'm pretty sure he has not sat down and read the book for, in any amount of time, he probably just got it. But, this is what the particular plan is, if that answers your question.
See, it's sort of twofold because I want to respond back to it because I actually thought the book was sort of confusing because you start off with that we ain't American piece, and then we're not African piece, and then you misread Wade Nobles because I remember quoting direct quotes from him that say we are Africans, and so, but then I looked through all the rest of it. Your name is African, you use all these African concepts, you use these African authors, but in the beginning, you're like, we're Americans. And so, yeah, it was a bit confusing, but I did read the book. You can go back and check the invoices and all that. I bought it quite long ago, caught part of the discount. But tell no lies, claim no easy victories. Whew. The long-term goals is, since I mainly focus, I like to call myself a cultural scientist, but my emphasis is the religious, spiritual piece. We're getting no power from these foreign systems that we relate to. So one of the long-term goals of re-identifying with who the hell we are is we can start getting power from our African deities and our African forces to do what we need to do. Obviously, we've only been calling on Jesus in America for about a good 100 and some odd years, maybe 200. But we can definitely see that has gotten us absolutely nowhere, nothing, no how, nothing. But when we were dealing with Asar, Aset, Tehuti, Ma'at, you see all those civilizations. When different groups were dealing with their traditional systems, you see Monombatapa, you see, ancient Ghana before the Arab invasion, stuff like that. So you see the Twa folks when they were dealing with their traditional spiritual systems. So one of the long-term goals for me at least is once we de-link from America and start relinking back to our African selves, then the question becomes, how do I make it applicable in my life? And one of the first things is reattaching. The first thing is reattaching the identity, just understanding that you're African. That's baseline. That's the top line of a geometry piece. That's the given. But then going on from there, getting an understanding of the spiritual system and using that and making it work for you. Also, using the culture, relinking ourselves back to our Africanness creates the group solidarity, creates group cohesion and predictability within the culture. Again, it's interesting, my verbal opponent did some, I'm going to pick this from Amos Wilson, I'm going to pick this from Amos Wilson, but he constantly is talking about reclamation and reconstitution. So he knows that it's not gone. We just need to reawaken to it. And then he lays out the advantages of doing that. And these books are written because we have been delinked, our consciousness has been delinked. But none of them challenge the identity piece. And I challenge you, sir, to find me one of these nationalist scholars who, again, say we're not African. And you danced around that question. Oh, I'm an independent researcher, so I can do things other folks don't. You are wrong on this point because they don't talk about identity. They say our consciousness was changed. Breaking the psychological images of slavery, not the identity. Falsification of African consciousness, not falsification of African identity. Blueprint for black. You see what I'm saying? It's the identity piece. It's the transformation of consciousness. The identity has not been wiped away. So tell no lies, claim no easy victories. We're not Americans. We're not lying when we say that. Tell no lies. We Africans. Claim no easy victories. It ain't going to be easy. Reclaiming Africanity in an anti-African world with white folks and black-skinned white folks telling us we're not African every day in every media ain't going to be easy. But there are folks here in D.C. that are doing it. There are folks in Florida that's doing it, Philly that's doing it, St. Louis that's doing it. I'm sure I'm leaving some. Atlanta that's doing it. I think that's Brother Densu. I don't know. But there are folks that are reconnecting. and doing the work, the culture, deep culture work that needs to be done. And we're going to continue, hopefully with Asar, but I don't know, we'll see.
Can I respond?
All right.
Hello?
Who's that?
This is Asar.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I want to point this out while it's fresh. He keeps contradicting himself because everyone that I quoted, every single last one, not one has contradicted this, states that identity and culture is a psychological process. You can't argue that there's been a change of consciousness and we need to reorient ourselves back to an African consciousness and say that we're African if they don't have an African consciousness. And it's funny how he likes to skip around on the book, and that's why I say you need to reread it. On page 17 of the Bacala of North America, I cite Dr. Oscar Hilliard. Oscar Hilliard talking about the whole concept of names in culture and things. He deals with this. He says this. These names, our original African names, were based upon our natal and cultural bonds and thousands of years of heritage. The names were based upon the collective history and creativity. Worse, we had forgotten why we named ourselves, how we came to be given alien names in the first place. Given the sacred nature of names to African people and given their association of a name with our identity as a family, this was a tragedy of enormous proportions. Our focus on names became a barren one, a focus without the benefit of awareness of our rich cultural traditions. Therefore, we were unprepared for the conversation about race, naming, and identity. We had come to a point where we, as a people, were named by others. Most of us had lost control of this, the most fundamental of human processes, the self-determining process of naming ourselves, of telling, not asking the world who we are. I quote again a little bit further down. He says, however, there simply was so very much more to who we were than our pigment. So how had we come to become preoccupied with what rather than who we are, with our political and economic struggle rather than with our essence and our destiny? How had we become individuals rather than family? How did we become a temporal people rather than an eternal people, a local rather than a cosmic people? Africans had seen it this way. Now, how are you going to make this argument? Because this is the same argument all of the other scholars are making, that the totality of what makes an African person was stripped. He just said this in many different ways when it came to naming and everything. You lost the nuances. That's why they're fighting for the Africanists, trying to get back and reorient ourselves. It's a psychological process. So you can't sit here and say, because from with this, he's not arguing that we're African. He's arguing that we're American, that we have the psychology of American people, white folks, and that we need to re-Africanize. That's what this argument is. That's what he's quoting. And I quote many people like this on this book, which I don't understand why you keep arguing this nonsensical, non-logical, contradictory statement, which you're trying to argue on one hand that it's about psychology, but then, we have to reawaken. This is about intent. It's about meaning. This is what all these scholars say. So, you're saying that not one of these African scholars said that we aren't Africans. We understand that they're talking about African in the biological sense. And that's why when he said that's why he said here, why do we come preoccupied with pigment, dealing with phenotype blackness, when Africans didn't deal with that? Obviously, we have a different consciousness. We have a different conceptual framework of the world, and we need to get back to that African consciousness. And this is what the scholars are saying. There's a difference between being African by biology, trying to make a race argument, and being African psychologically. My argument, as I stated plainly in the beginning, I'm not arguing biology. The biology argument is ripped with too many problems, which you cannot reconcile, trying to prove the concept of race. Everything deals with psychology, and language deals with psychology. So, how do you address that?
Wait, hold on, because I don't want y'all to get into a back and forth yet, because I want the next caller to ask the question. Anybody else have a question? Unmute your phone and chime in. Hello. Anybody there?
I got another question.
Yeah.
Everybody's on mute. Damn.
I got another question. If ain't nobody gonna ask that.
Go ahead. Go for it.
Is that Brother Densu?
Man, don't say my name already.
My bad.
He's been out.
He's blowing his spot up.
No, I appreciate this conversation, but I'm trying to get both of y'all to see how much y'all agree with each other, brother. And this is a simple question that I think both of y'all had these experiences. Brother Affair, let's deal with the African worldview and not deal with biology. And I assume you're involved in the Ifa tradition in the Congo.
I'm sorry, you're fading out. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me again?
Now I can hear you.
Okay. I said, just to build like a consensus, I said, Brother Sarah, let's deal with the African worldview and not necessarily the question of biology in the way that you've articulated. We are a product of our ancestors, right? And if we are a product of our ancestors and we're born of them, there's certain things that are passed on to us spiritually, biologically, psychologically, physically, that may transcend our very narrow concepts of race, based on race as a Western biological concept. So like the Congo, I believe, talk about the Bakula, or, that realm of the ancestors that's like an ocean of knowledge.
Talking about the Musini. The Bakula is what you call ancestors. The realm is called Musoni.
Well,
or if you could say the Kalunga line.
Right, but I'm talking. Yeah, I'm with you on that. But we're saying essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
But that was coming out of the Mbongi. So this idea that people could be born into a culture of double consciousness or a culture of conflict, but their ancestors pushed them into that space to resolve things, for the lineage, for the community, for the national reality, right? That's I want us to kind of consider that to get Kamal's point. And Kamal, I want you to consider what he's saying in terms of intent, and I believe you do, because a shrine house without a community, without a political formation, without land, is just another impotent religious institution. So this issue of culture as active, culture as ideological, culture as political is something to consider. And I guess the big question is when we focus on a weakness, we may focus on it to the extent that we take it in isolation, and we don't see it in relationship to its parts or to the whole. So language is critical, but language is not the only thing. Spirit is, or the shrines are critical, but the shrine is not the only thing.
Brother, are you asking a direct question though?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Like
I'm asking them to deal with. Yeah, I guess I am. Deal with what each other is saying, because I really believe y'all agree more so than y'all disagree, and it seems like y'all harping on things that is really not the point that y'all driving at. That, I guess, that's more of a statement. So if the brother, if you saying you're not dealing with biology, but you believe in Ifa and the ancestors, wouldn't that agree with Kamal?
Here's the difference. See, here's the difference. It's kind of hard to really have this discussion and to really understand this among a group of people who are African-centered, have African consciousness, honor African deities and ancestors because we're all on the same page. But if we were to have this discussion in the midst of the general population, you will see the differences between how they think and how we think. I'm thinking in the realms of totality as far as consciousness is concerned. There is no culture without intent. That's what all of the quotes from all of these people say, regardless if you read 100 pages into their book. Every single time they bring up culture, they bring up intent. And, without intent, it's nothing. It doesn't exist because you have no goal, you have no purpose. To be African, what I'm essentially arguing is to be African is to live life on purpose. That's what all my studies on Africa, everything has a purpose. So it's just like, I don't know how familiar you are with the systems, but you know for a fact that Africans do not have art for art's sake. Art serves a purpose. It has a spiritual purpose. It serves the purpose of the law of attraction, what they do over here with a vision board and things of this nature. We don't do art for art's sake because that is built off of a culture of purpose. Everything must serve a purpose. If it doesn't serve a purpose, we get rid of it. So that's what it means to be African. So you can't be in a realm with no purpose and then claim to be African when their whole system is based on purpose. A matter of fact, you know that when a person is born, divination happens to find out what's the child's purpose. The whole system, the whole culture is centered around how can we make the child live up to his purpose, his or her purpose. If anybody has read Dr. Malidoma Some's work of Water in the Spirit, or The Healing Wisdom of Africa, or Fukiao, Self-Healing Power and Therapy, or African Cosmology, the Bantu we name any African source. Everyone does not one of them contradicts themselves of talking about when a child comes into this world, that he comes here with a purpose, and it's up to the priest or whatnot to divine and to ask what the child's purpose is. And matter of fact, speaking of purpose, I will quote Dr. Kakosa Kajangu. He's an initiated scholar, studied as well under Credu Mutwa out of South Africa. He's actually originally from the Congo, so he's in the Congo systems as well. So he talks about, and I'm trying to find the page in which I quote him in my book. In my book on page 15, for the records of the people who's listening, Dr. Kakosa Kajango in his book this is actually his PhD dissertation. It's called Beyond the Colonial Gaze, Reconstructing African Wisdom Traditions. He talks about, and I'm quoting now, the ancestral vision is a vivid expression that describes why a particular community of memory exists and what types of human beings it intends to deliver. It expresses the feelings that members of that community of memory hold for their community and its place in the world. Often this vision, and I have this underlined, often this vision is the name that the community gives to itself. So not only do we deal with divination trying to figure out the name to attach to in relationship to the purpose of a child, the whole name of the community itself encapsulates the vision, the purpose of the community, why they even came together in the first place. So when you talk about Africa, this is why I stress this point. If European people named you Africans, and it was not built on your own genius, your own purpose, your own meanings, you don't even know what the term African means, then you can't say that you're living like it's quote-unquote African because they know what their names mean. They know what the purpose of their community means. So it's even more problematic when we start dealing with African Americans when the majority of us don't even deal with Africa. They don't know what it means to live a life on purpose. And this is where the contradiction, where the fundamental contradiction in this discussion is coming from. Because we don't live life intentionally, it's hard for us to grasp. And this is what I'm trying to argue throughout this whole book. Learn to live life on purpose. When you live life on purpose, this is how you create economies. Because everything is based on your culture, which instructs you on what your mission is here on earth. So, I understand what you're saying, but there's a very fundamental difference in the argument that we are making. And to me, he's really not making an argument because you're skipping around the intentionality part. And that is critical to this whole process. Sure, language is one part. I mentioned that language is one part. But it is the most critical, the most fundamental to defining a culture. And that's my point. So we can't leave out language. It's one of the most critical things. And I quoted the African scholars, the initiated pre-African scholars, who deal with this and say, once you lose your language, you cease to be your ethnicity. So, this is why I'm arguing. This is why throughout the book I'm quoting African terms. I even mention the African terms that we still say here that we think is English. We're talking about Uber, jazz, jam. I deal with these culturalisms to demonstrate to the people that these are the African concepts. These are the constructs that we brought over here, which we still retain. So now it's up to you to recognize that they are African and to organize them into a cultural system so we can utilize our Africanness to build economies, to build a stronger political system, because this is what culture is supposed to do. It deals with power. That's why in Blueprint for Black Power, after stating what power is, the first thing he deals with, he has a whole chapter on identity and culture. Why does he deal with culture first? Why does Sheikh Anta Diop deal with culture first in Black Africa, an economic and cultural basis for a federated state? Why, we dealing with culture first? Because culture is the most important thing. There is no political unity. There is no economics unless you have the cultural piece organized first. So this is what, my mission is, to organize the culture so people are conscious of it, to create institutions where we can pass this knowledge on and we can build and bring new knowledge and not just hark over, Egypt as the end-all, be-all to African civilization, and to understand that we are an extension of these African systems and that we can create and do better than what the Egyptians did and what the Malayans did, what Songhai did, what Timbuktu did. All you have to do is be in the same consciousness that they were in. But in order to understand that, you need to understand the languages and how they saw the world. So this is why I deal with languages for the most part. Sorry to take up that much time. Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, we have.
Everybody? Oh, okay.
Brother Kamal, can I ask Brother Kamal, the language that Asar is speaking about, as far as when we lost our language, we lost the ability to communicate in our original tongue, or the tongue that we came from, whatever tribe that is. That's when we lost that. What's your take on that, as far as that being the focal point of not being able to claim that, or as far as losing your language and the ramifications or the implications of that?
Yeah, maybe he missed this piece, but I did quote two linguists, and then I ended with Melissa. I agree that conceptualizing the world in an African language would be different from conceptualizing it in a European or other language. I'd be stupid to argue otherwise. As far as that being the linchpin that he keeps coming back to, I'm hard pressed to go with him on that, because language is still a tangible aspect of identity. And I thought, maybe he didn't hear it either, but I laid out 5 areas within, when you combine them all, that those things are identity. And language fit within the psychic function. But you also have biogenetics. And I mentioned some research that Diop did that I didn't hear him refute, but he skipped over it too. So I don't know if it has been refuted or if he didn't like it because it didn't fit his paradigm. I don't know on the biogenetic piece. But so while we do not have the actual, I want to bring back, since you brought it up, I would want to hear what he had to say about this with the linguists now that I brought up, I remember when the Ebonics debate was going on, one critical thing that slid under the table was that all of the people they put in front of the cameras to talk it down weren't linguists. Freaking Bill Cosby, Maya Angelou, and other entertainers and all that. But the linguists, white folks and black folks across the board, pretty much agreed that, yeah, stolen Africans over here are, still following their West African language systems, but they didn't get the microphone. So while he's talking about language and maybe just vocabulary, I thought I had brought in information that showed that syntactical structure and idiomatic rules, we've brought that over. We're not told that that's what we're doing, but when linguists look at how we speak over here, and when they study the West African language systems that we came from, they're identical except for the words. And so I had mentioned the tense, I had mentioned consonant clusters, I was going to add in tonality, and that's just a few. You can check out, what they said and talking and testifying by Dr. Smitherman. So I do agree that language is a big part, but he has fully overemphasized it and still hasn't really brought up the spiritual aspect, because it's the spiritual aspect alone that hasn't even been touched by this Ma'afa experience. But then also it's that aspect is in with what makes us African. That aspect is within the. So if the language has been lost, if all the rates and the biogenetic stuff seems to be still out of whack, on the tangible type of stuff has been thrown out of whack, but on that deep, deep spiritual piece, which ain't been mentioned by him, because I don't know, I ain't gonna get into that. That piece has not changed. And the reflecting on pieces, and I ain't going to get into nitpicking. I'm very well familiar with Dr. Wade Nobles. I'm very well familiar. Right now, if you want to go there, I'm co-facilitator of a book study group on Blueprint for Black Power. I am very well adept with Amos Wilson. And so that part, that was funny. I'll even throw out a challenge here. I want to challenge Asar to get Dr. Wade Nobles or Marimba Ani on his blog talk show. I have contact information of people who know them directly, and if you're going to present this American with Africanism argument to them, that would be very interesting. If you want to do that, we can talk about that, because Wade, I think Wade would chop you up from misreading his words. And Marimba Ani and Let the Circle Be Unbroken totally goes into the spiritual depth of why we're African, which I ain't heard you mention or quote or use or anything. So I'd love to get those, since I haven't articulated it well, since I'm bouncing around like you say, let's get some folks who have written on it in depth and who could probably explain it better than I am, and maybe then you'll see the right now error in your ways. Because some of your other stuff, I'm going to say it on record, it's brilliant, that African superhighway information. I love that. The idea of questioning what is Kemet and what came in from Kemet, I love that. You're just missing something right here. I'm through.
All right.
I hope that answers your question, sir.
Before Sar responds,
yes.
I wanted to ask the question to the both of you, because I haven't heard this, and Asar had mentioned it in his book, but I'm going to ask it to both of you. Can you have a culture absent land?
I mean, okay. Now let me distinguish and let me say this first. Do you want me to answer this question and he answer, and then I get back to the questions that he posed?
Sure. You can go back to him after this.
Okay, cool.
I want you to answer, and then I want Kamal to answer afterwards.
To really kind of answer that question, it's kind of we would have to suspend the law of physics, because human beings don't exist anywhere on Earth without land. Gravity ensures that we stay on the land. My argument isn't based on whether we have our own land. It is based on simply that we're on someone else's land, and it's their culture in which we've adopted. And so it's not an issue of, in that respect, because we don't have our own land, we don't have our own culture. Now, I do argue that the real fundamentals of culture, because culture, again, you have to have in your language reference points for your cosmology, for how you interact, for instance, in the case of African people, they use the substratum, which we all agree on. Part of the substratum is that they look at nature to look for rules and how to govern their society. Now, in America, that's not the case, but we can still develop a culture here. It's not the matter of which land, it's just what land you're on. And how do you reference that land in including it in terms of psychology, in terms of cultural motifs. Like when we talk about the Meta-Nature writing, all it is just things that they saw in their natural environment, used with phonetic values. So, and they use that system, and in other parts it's not strictly that, it's mainly cosmological in dealing with the cosmos, like when we talk about the Congo system. It's based upon this movement of stars and the sun. Same thing with Dogon and Zulu. So it's just a matter of where you're at. And this is why I included at the end of the book this Appendix B, which is called Simultaneous Validity. I quote heavily in the book an individual by the name of Jordan Ngubani, who wrote a book called Conflict of Minds. And the whole book is arguing the difference between European and Bantu Zulu culture and how these different cosmologies conflict with each other because they have different mindsets, they have different goals, just different everything. And Diop has argued this, northern versus southern cradle. It's nothing new. But he goes into it differently. So he starts explaining how, for the mind of the African, it doesn't matter where you're at, as long as you use where you're at to develop your cultural system. And where you're at, if you use the natural environment and everything to develop your cultural systems, and, the world has to respect it just like they would anything else. So, and this is why I argue, are these people Africans that are in Australia, even though they didn't exist on the African continent? Because, these are these contradictions we have to deal with here. They're black. You have people in Hawaii that's black. People in South America, you have people still in China who are black. Are they Africans? And that's where this confusion in a lot of these debates come in. But I'll end right there and let him answer.
Hello.
Well,
I'm just a little. Let me just say, Kamal, I'm just a little confused with the history of our history as far as we know with slavery, how we came here versus maybe the history of maybe in someone from Australia that might have a different history. We can actually trace. There's an actual lineage and a root that says that we were once in the place that they call Africa, and we were brought over here, whether it be enslaved or some of us were already over here. If you want to go to either the Sodomans, the Olmecs, or whatever. Did we lose, because we lost the language and we lost the culture, we lost that, did we lose the right to say that we're Africans? Or are we just Africans that have amnesia? Or a person that has lost himself. His name is Billy. He doesn't know his name is Billy. Does that mean that he's not Billy? And that's the thing that I was kind of wrestling with. Because we lost our language and we lost our language, our religion, our culture, our God. Does that mean that we are not Africans because we lost that, or we just lost the identity of that?
We lost the consciousness of that. Again, Wade Nobles talks about the depth structure of culture. The topmost level is the surface level. The next level is the ideas or ideational level, and the deepest level is the assumptions level, where axiology, cosmology, all that's on. So where where we get to answer your question. While the first level definitely has been changed from us, from Australian folks who are African, adapting to different natural environments. But the surface level stuff has been changed. That's the most malleable area. That next level, worldview, ethos, ideation, that can be subject to change, but you have some rigidity in that as well. But when you get down to that deep the deep level, the assumptions level, epistemology, how you know knowledge, cosmology, how you relate to the universe and other and the aspects within the universe. That's at the level where where Marimbo talks about, that's at the level where you need to look at for the commonalities of all these different disparate African groups throughout the world. And when you look down at that deep level, you see that while the Australian folks are black, they also still have the circle dance. They also have the dream time, which is almost identical to the ancestral realm and stuff like that. Again, the circle dance to venerate and have actual deities join with their physical body. They got that when they came from the continent, voluntarily over to where they are. And when you start using that type of precision to find those commonalities and similarities, you'll see that they are there and they exist at that deep level. And it's at that deep level that Dr. Nobles and Marimba Ani and Ajay Akoto and all of them used, and Kobe Cambone used to lock us into, if you will, our deep level Africanness. So while the surface levels and that middle range level has been changed, a white sheet's been put over it, on that deep level, we're still African, but we don't know it. Like you said, amnesia. Like in Falsification of African Consciousness, you got the historical amnesia piece. There wasn't a 100% severance and cut and disconnection. A damn white sheet with whoever flagged the white folks in the land that you in, they sprayed that white sheet with that flag. All we need to do is pull that white sheet off, see our Africanness, relate to it, connect to it, and then use it to do what we need to do. So it's an amnesia. We weren't fully disconnected.
Again, this is Asar. The argument he's making doesn't make any sense because I'm arguing that we have the substratum. That's why I say in the book and in this debate, we are Americans with Afrikanisms. If I'm arguing for Africanisms, I'm not arguing for total severance from Africa.
But you say it. You say it. You deliberately say it in the book.
No, I don't. That's why, matter of fact, if I have to quote me saying Africanism, I'll do it. Let me find it real quick. This whole topic. This is it's the book Africanisms in American Culture, which inspired this topic in the first place.
It opened me up to the fact that although we are African people by blood, we are not African by culture. We are Americans with Africanisms.
Exactly. What does that mean? That means everything that you just said. We're talking about the totality of a culture. You just said it yourself, that we are not the totality of the culture, that we need to be reawakened to it has been veiled. That there's a deep, we have to go deep, we have to go to the spirit world to understand the Africanness in who we are. This isn't the stuff that's on the surface. This is your argument.
Can I ask a question?
I would like to first address what he said beforehand, if we can, and I'll make this brief. Sure, I am confident in myself that I can address this with any scholar on the books, and if Dr. Wade Nobles disagrees, then we can have this discussion, and I'll present the evidence, and he can present his evidence, and then we'll let the people decide. I have no qualms against it. As a matter of fact, before I even published the book, I had the stuff sent to many, many different scholars, including Mr. Malese Asante, who you quote. He's read the book, gave the book praise. He gave me some pointers before, I even published it. This isn't, I just don't write stuff and just, hope. I have it scrutinized first. And I deal with a lot of these scholars on a personal level regardless. So, but him personally I have not dealt with. And I've actually tried to get in contact with him to send him a copy of the book, but I haven't heard back from him. So if you find someone that can get in contact with him and he wants to have this discussion, and he understands the merit of what I'm talking about, then I'm all good for it. But I forgot the second aspect of what your original question was. Besides that second half, can you please repeat? Talking to Brother Kamal.
Oh, I ain't even jot that down. I'll let that go.
I forgot. But I'm sorry, someone's
Can
going to ask
I
a
ask a
question.
listener? Yeah. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, it seems like there's as I was listening, I was having a hard time with the idea that you said we are Americans with Africanisms, and then many of the things that you're saying are defending a more common African-centered notion that we need to re-Africanize. So it sounds like, in a way, an intellectual sleight of hand, because it's saying with your mouth, we are Americans on the first note, which, if we're not going to deal in semantics, would mean that the argument against it would be we are African. So it becomes semantics if you say we are Americans, and then you advertise, or you sort of are on the same side of the people who would say no, we're Africans. And then added to it is a bit of confusion, because you're saying, well, these people are saying that we're Africans, but really, if you look deeply at their arguments, they're really saying that we're Americans. So if you take Asa Hilliard, for example, who you use as an example, Asa Hilliard has a book called African Power, where he says to be African or not to be. So I think that if what you're doing is, it's hard to figure out if it's one of two things. Is it that you're trying to make it more complex so that readers and people who study African-centered science will think deeper about these ideas generally? Or are you really in disagreement that we're Africans, because you also then say you're not in disagreement with that, because you say, I guess in our blood we're African. But in our consciousness, are we or are we not? There's a lot of sort of back and forth. You're bobbing and weaving, and it's creating, I'm getting a little dizzy listening. I've been on since the beginning, because I want to see exactly, I want to be clear. If it's just semantics, then let's not argue semantics. You both agree that we're Africans, and you both agree that we have some Americanisms. If it's more than semantics, then why pose it as on the with the prefix of the statement being we are Americans? Okay. Do you understand my point?
I understand your point, and in short, and I'm gonna ask you a question, because all I'm going to do is repeat what I've said already. It is to bring more clarity, to bring out the contradictions in the statements, because a lot of what people are trying to say that we're Africans is biological, and you can't make a biological argument. You will lose the biological argument, because everybody's African.
You're saying a lot of what people
a lot
are
of scholars, a lot of people.
Can you name them? Because that would be a little bit more. I think it'd be more convincing if you could name those scholars who are making that biological argument.
For instance, Dr. Wade Nobles often makes that distinction in the commercial in which Brother Kamal put together. He quotes Malcolm X. He makes a biological argument. And what I'm arguing is that by biology, that's why I asked him, and he didn't address this, what is the racial criteria to distinguish races?
Maybe that's a point of contention, because Wade Nobles would never make a biological argument because he's a psychologist. So he would make a psychological argument. That's a mute argument, because being a psychologist doesn't mean you can't make a biological argument. It doesn't mean you can't, but he wouldn't do that if he is a psychologist and he writes about things like Sekou and things about things having to do with the mind. Sheikh Joke was a physicist, but he made biological arguments. Can you prove that? But you're saying these things about people. What this really amounts to is an accusation, because you can't define biological argument and then put the person in the category after you define it. We don't have time. If you want me to send you references, I can do that. But what I'm saying is that when you make the statement, I think. Let me just take one more second here. When you make the statement that a person is making a biological argument, and then what you're doing now is you're saying that becomes like one of the major fallacies of some African-centered thinkers. They make a biological argument. However, you have not set it up so that audiences can know what a biological argument is, how it's defined, and how we should be thinking of that.
We only have so much time, brother.
But it's a major part of your argument. It's a major part of your argument, though.
It is not. That's a part of this. So much of the argument that I haven't even addressed yet. You know, and it's because of the time constraints. For instance, I would ask you if I have a. I'll ask you this question. I'm gonna ask you the simple question. If I have a steering wheel, some brakes, and a back seat, does that mean that I have a car?
You could have a truck. You could have a semi.
No. I gave you 3 specific items. I said you only possess a steering wheel, some brakes, and a back seat. Does that mean you have a car?
There's lots of other things you could have besides a car. So no,
that's not the question. The question is, can you have a car with a steering wheel?
You could have a car. Yeah, it could be a car. Could be a car. Yeah.
Okay. Define a car with just a steering wheel, brakes, and a back seat. From the common understanding of what a car is and what a car does.
I think mine is a simple proposition. If you're
this is very simple. This is you're missing my point because you're trying to put bits and pieces in it and you're not understanding the argument. What I'm arguing is exactly, and I'm trying to tell you that there's component parts that work in sync with each other that define what a culture is. That's why I quoted Amadou Hapati-Ba when he talked about the Fulani, that you can have your speech, your trade, and your genetics. If you lose 2 of those, you can still function. But once you lose the 3rd, you cease to be your ethnicity. He's talking about
so it's incomplete.
So it's incomplete.
It is incomplete.
It's not a culture. It's not an ethnicity.
Yeah, his topology is incomplete, and it's also not.
That would just further prove my question, because when we're talking about African spirituality, is the majority of African Americans African-centered in their spirituality? Do they worship Olodumare? Do they know about Kalunga? Do they still say Mulunga when we reference God?
The fact that you're now running down that list of things makes it more confusing, because on the one hand, I went down this list. On the one hand, you're saying
I quoted these things. That's my whole point. I keep repeating myself because y'all missing the point.
You're repeating yourself.
This is why I wrote down.
We have 1 minute, fellas. I wish you would have called it a little earlier, caller. You make some great questions. I wish you would have called a little earlier.
I'm sorry. I was actually we were having dinner, but I'm sorry, and I'll be really brief, and then I'm going to actually just sit back and listen. I just want to make one more. My point to Asar is that I've heard several different layers. The layers that you're presenting are one that seems to critique the majority of African-centered ideologists, but then at the same time you sort of agree with them. Then it seems as though you sort of are presenting that the problem that what they're saying is that they present a biological argument, yet you've not really laid out what that really means in the context of this conversation. And then when someone comes and says, well, like the caller earlier said, I think you 2 brothers agree.